The Blood Oath Pact, structural constraint, entertainment as warning, and the exposed individual I, the problem of defection. Every hierarchy faces the same fundamental engineering problem from the moment it forms. People have options. As long as a member of any organized structure can calculate that leaving, betraying, or cooperating with an enemy produces a better personal outcome than staying loyal, the hierarchy is vulnerable at every node. The person with the best offer wins the node. The hierarchy with the deepest pockets buys the most loyalty. The structure dissolves not through frontal assault, but through the quiet arithmetic of better deals flowing through its membership, until nothing remains but the leadership holding an organization that has already been hollowed out. This is not a hypothetical failure mode. It is the default trajectory of every organized structure that doesn't solve the defection problem. Armies that flee when the battle turns. Revolutionary movements that fracture when the state offers amnesty to key figures. Criminal enterprises that collapse when prosecutors offer immunity to the right informant. Political parties that dissolve when the opposing party offers enough to enough members. The defection problem is the central engineering challenge of hierarchy. Everything else is secondary. The blood oath is the solution. 2. The engineering of absolute loyalty. The blood oath, in whatever form it takes across cultures and contexts, is not primarily a ritual. It is not primarily about honor, tradition, or spiritual commitment, though it deploys all of these as delivery mechanisms. It is a defection elimination mechanism. Its engineering is precise and its logic is clean. By binding membership to consequences that no external offer can outbid, death, the death of family, the destruction of everything the member values, it converts the defection calculation from a variable into a constant. There is no longer a price at which betrayal becomes rational. The calculation has been structurally removed. The result is a hierarchy whose nodes cannot be purchased, flipped, or negotiated away. Each member is a binary variable, loyal or eliminated. There is no third state, no negotiation interface, no arbitrage opportunity for a better resourced competitor. This is not brutality for its own sake. It is precision engineering applied to the loyalty problem. The death consequence isn't there to punish, it's there to make the calculation impossible. You cannot outbid death. You cannot offer someone more than their continued existence plus the continued existence of everyone they love. Therefore, no one can outbid the blood oath hierarchy for its own members' loyalty. The hierarchy becomes structurally impenetrable from below. 3. What the blood oath actually buys. To understand why this logic is inescapable, you need to understand what the blood oath purchases beyond simple loyalty. It purchases time horizon alignment. An ordinary employee calculates over a short time horizon. What does this decision cost or benefit me this week, this year, this career? A blood oath member calculates over a life horizon. What does this decision cost or benefit me across my entire existence and the existence of my family? These are categorically different calculations. The blood oath member will absorb short-term costs that would cause any ordinary member to defect. Because the long-term calculus is absolute, it purchases operational security. A structure whose members can be flipped leaks. Every node is a potential intelligence source for competitors and enemies. A blood oath structure leaks only through death. The member takes information out of the structure only by ceasing to exist. This makes the structure operationally opaque in a way no other loyalty mechanism achieves. You cannot interrogate someone into cooperation when cooperation means their family dies. You cannot offer witness protection credible enough to outweigh the certainty of blood oath enforcement. It purchases recursive self-defense. The blood oath doesn't just protect the hierarchy from external attack, it protects it from internal reform. Any member who decides the hierarchy's direction is wrong, corrupt, or counterproductive faces the same consequence as any traitor. Because from the hierarchy's perspective, internal challenge and external betrayal are structurally identical threats to the monopoly. The blood oath, therefore, doesn't just solve the defection problem, it solves the reform problem simultaneously. The hierarchy becomes self-sealing against change from within. It purchases legitimacy through certainty. Every structure requires its members and subjects to believe that non-compliance is more costly than compliance. Legal states achieve this through the credible threat of prosecution. Criminal hierarchies achieve it through the credible threat of violence. The blood oath makes the credible threat absolute. Not you might get caught and prosecuted, but you will die and your family will die. This is not a probabilistic deterrent, it is a certainty deterrent. The legitimacy it produces is total within its domain. Why every serious hierarchy converges on this logic. Here is the observation that most political theory refuses to state plainly. The blood oath is not a feature of primitive, brutal, or criminal organizations. It is the logical endpoint of any hierarchy that faces serious competition for its monopoly and solves the defection problem rigorously. State militaries enforce blood oath logic through treason and desertion laws. The consequence for defection to the enemy is death. Intelligence services enforce it through classification systems backed by criminal prosecution and, in practice, through eliminating members who become liabilities. Criminal networks enforce it explicitly through oaths and demonstrated willingness to execute violators. Revolutionary vanguards enforce it through internal security apparatus. The NKVD, the Stasi, the various revolutionary tribunals that processed internal enemies with the same machinery used on external ones. The form varies, the logic is identical, and the convergence is not accidental. It is selection pressure at work. Hierarchies that solve the defection problem absolutely outcompete hierarchies that solve it partially. A structure willing to kill traitors defeats a structure that merely fires them. A structure that enforces silence through death produces better operational security than a structure that enforces it through contracts. A structure that eliminates internal challenges maintains directional coherence longer than a structure that tolerates internal opposition. Over time, through competition, conflict, and the simple mechanics of organizational survival, the hierarchies that remain standing are the ones that converged most completely on blood oath logic. The ones that didn't are historical footnotes. This is not moral observation. It is evolutionary mechanics applied to organizational structures. V. The alternative's structural weakness. Every alternative to blood oath hierarchy, every structure organized around consent, voluntary participation, democratic accountability, and the genuine right of members to exit, is by its very structure a weaker hierarchy. Not weaker in every dimension, weaker specifically in the dimension that matters most for surviving direct competition with blood oath structures, the defection problem. A democratic organization offers its members alternatives. You can leave, you can dissent, you can advocate for change through internal processes. You can cooperate with external investigators without facing death. These are genuine goods. They're what makes democratic structures more humane, more adaptable, more capable of genuine self-correction. They are also precisely the mechanisms through which blood oath structures infiltrate, corrupt, and eventually capture democratic alternatives. The member who can leave can be recruited by a competing structure before leaving. The member who can dissent can be identified as a potential defector and approached with better offers. The member who can cooperate with external investigators will, when the pressure is sufficient, cooperate. The structure that cannot enforce absolute loyalty through absolute consequences cannot prevent any of these failure modes. The alternative is not just weaker, it is structurally legible to blood oath hierarchies, in ways that blood oath hierarchies are not legible to it. The blood oath structure can read the alternative's vulnerability map completely. Every exit point is a potential infiltration point. Every dissenter is a potential asset. Every accountability mechanism is a potential leverage point. The alternative cannot read the blood oath structure's internal map at all because the map is sealed by the enforcement mechanism itself. This asymmetry is total and structural. It doesn't depend on the quality of the people involved. It doesn't depend on the sophistication of the alternative's design. It emerges from the foundational difference between structures that offer alternatives and structures that don't. Fees, entertainment as state pedagogy. Here is where the analysis enters territory most cultural criticism misses entirely. The Godfather, Goodfellas, The Sopranos, The Wire, Narcos, Peaky Blinders, Scarface, Breaking Bad, Sons of Anarchy, Boardwalk Empire. The entertainment industry's obsession with organized crime, blood oath hierarchies and criminal power structures is not accidental. It is not simply because these stories are dramatically compelling, though they are. It is not simply because audiences find transgressive power fantasies entertaining, though they do. It is because the state has a specific and structural interest in making sure you understand these organizations exist, understand how they work, understand their internal logic, and understand that you are not in one. The state hates competition. This is the most precise framing of why blood oath entertainment is not just permitted but actively celebrated, awarded, distributed globally, and produced at enormous scale by the same cultural apparatus the state broadly controls and influences. The state's monopoly on legitimate violence is only as strong as the population's compliance with it. That compliance depends partly on the population believing that alternatives to state protection are unavailable, that there is nowhere else to go for security, dispute resolution, economic opportunity outside legal markets, and protection from predation. Criminal organizations represent a direct competitive threat to this monopoly. They offer exactly what the state offers: protection, dispute resolution, economic opportunity, community belonging, outside the state's framework and without the state's cut. The state cannot eliminate these organizations. History demonstrates this conclusively. Every serious suppression effort produces adaptive evolution rather than elimination. The blood oath structure is specifically engineered to survive suppression, as we have derived. What the state can do is manage the population's relationship to these organizations. And the most effective management tool is entertainment. What blood oath entertainment actually teaches. Watch the narrative arc of every serious organized crime production carefully. The structure is almost invariant. The blood oath hierarchy is portrayed with seductive competence in the early acts. The internal logic is made visible and comprehensible. The power is shown as real and the belonging as genuine. The audience is allowed to understand the appeal completely, not as a failure of the production, but as a deliberate feature. You must understand why people join to understand why you shouldn't. Then the consequences arrive. Always. With the same structural reliability as the defection enforcement mechanism itself. The blood oath consumes its members. The loyalty that protected them becomes the trap that destroys them. The family that was protected becomes the leverage point for their destruction. The belonging that made the hierarchy worth joining becomes the mechanism of their final elimination. No one exits clean. No one exits alive if they exit at all. The blood oath that promised protection delivers annihilation. The message is precisely calibrated. We are showing you this world completely enough that you understand it, and we are showing you its endpoint completely enough that you don't enter it. This is state pedagogy dressed as entertainment. The Sopranos isn't a celebration of organized crime. It's an 86-episode demonstration of what the blood oath does to everyone it touches. The Wire isn't an endorsement of drug hierarchies. It's a systems-level demonstration of how blood oath structures consume participants at every level: dealers, police, politicians, journalists, without producing anything but their own continuation. The lesson embedded in every one of these productions is identical. The blood oath structure is real, it is powerful, it is comprehensible, and it will destroy you. Stay out. Why the lesson has to be shown, not told. The state cannot simply declare these organizations dangerous and expect compliance. The declaration would be correctly identified as self-serving. Of course, the existing monopoly on violence wants you to believe the competing monopoly is dangerous. The declaration would also fail empirically. In communities where the state's monopoly has already failed, where the state offers nothing but predation and neglect, the competing monopolies offering is visibly superior, and no declaration changes that observable fact. The entertainment has to do what the declaration cannot. It has to make the internal logic of the blood oath comprehensible enough that the audience genuinely understands the appeal, and then demonstrate the consequences through narrative rather than assertion. You can argue with an assertion. You cannot argue with 86 episodes of Tony Soprano's life, destroying everyone he touches, including himself. The demonstration bypasses the rational defense because it operates through identification and narrative rather than claim and counterclaim. This is sophisticated state communication operating through cultural production. It doesn't require conspiracy, it requires alignment of incentives. Studios want compelling narratives. Compelling narratives about blood oath hierarchies have a natural arc toward destruction. The state benefits from that arc being shown at scale. The incentives align without requiring coordination. The dangerous dimension of the education. Here is where the entertainment as pedagogy observation becomes more complex. The education works in both directions. The person the state wants to keep outside the blood oath structure learns from the godfather that these structures exist, are powerful, and are destructive. Correct lesson. From the state's perspective, the person already inside or adjacent to these structures, or the person for whom the state's monopoly has already failed completely, learn something different from the same material. They learn the organizational logic, they learn the defection elimination mechanism, they learn the operational security principles, they learn how the hierarchy maintains itself against both internal and external threats. The Godfather is simultaneously a warning to the civilian population and an organizational manual for anyone who reads it structurally rather than narratively. The state cannot produce one without producing the other, because the comprehensibility that makes the warning effective is the same comprehensibility that makes the manual legible. This is an unresolvable tension in the state's use of entertainment as pedagogy. To warn effectively, it must show completely. To show completely, it must educate structurally. The structural education is available to everyone who receives the warning. 7th, the exposed individual, life outside the blood oath. Now we arrive at the most personally relevant dimension of this entire analysis. You are reading this. You are almost certainly not a member of a blood oath hierarchy. You exist outside every blood oath structure operating in your territory. The state's military and intelligence apparatus, the criminal networks, the various organizational forms that have converged on blood oath logic. This is your precise structural position, an individual without a blood oath, in a territory controlled by multiple overlapping blood oath hierarchies. What this means in practice: you have no monopoly on violence. You cannot enforce anything. Your property rights exist only insofar as the state's blood oath hierarchy chooses to enforce them on your behalf, and it enforces them selectively, at its discretion, according to its own interests rather than yours. Your labor is extracted at rates set by structures you cannot negotiate with as an equal because you bring no violence to the negotiation. Your employer operates within a legal framework written by capital interest. Your wages reflect what the market, itself a structure shaped by blood oath hierarchies, will bear, not what your labor is worth in any absolute sense. Your security depends entirely on structures you do not control and cannot influence. If the state's enforcement apparatus decides your security is not worth its resources, as it routinely decides for communities without political capital, you have no recourse. If a criminal hierarchy decides your business or neighborhood is worth taxing, which is what protection rackets are, you have no counter-offer. You pay or you face consequences from a structure whose enforcement capacity you cannot match. Your legal rights exist on paper and in practice only when the blood oath hierarchy that writes and enforces the law finds it in its interest to honor them. The history of legal rights is entirely a history of blood oath hierarchies deciding when and for whom those rights are real. They are not absolute. They are conditional on the hierarchy's judgment that honoring them is less costly than ignoring them. The exploitation mechanism is structural, not personal. The person extracting value from your unprotected position is not necessarily malicious. They are operating the logic of their position within a blood oath structure, just as you are operating the logic of your position outside one. The landlord charging maximum rent is operating within a property rights framework enforced by the state's monopoly on violence. They are not personally predatory. They are running the rational calculation available to anyone holding an asset, protected by a blood oath hierarchy against individuals who have no comparable protection. The employer offering minimum viable wages is running the same calculation. Your labor is worth what you can extract from the negotiation. You bring to that negotiation your skills, your alternatives, your willingness to walk away. You do not bring enforcement capacity. The employer operating within a legal framework backed by state violence brings the implicit threat that non-compliance, striking, organizing, refusing, will be met with legal consequences enforced by the state's blood oath apparatus. The negotiation is not between equals. It was never between equals. The inequality is structural and derives directly from the asymmetry between those inside blood oath hierarchies and those outside them. The criminal hierarchy's exploitation of the unprotected, where the state's blood oath hierarchy is absent or indifferent. In communities it is written off, in economic spaces it doesn't monitor, in the informal economy that exists beneath legal frameworks, criminal blood oath hierarchies fill the vacuum and run the same extraction logic. The protection racket is the purest expression of this. Pay us a percentage of your revenue and we will not harm you or allow others to harm you. This is structurally identical to taxation. The difference is branding. The state calls its extraction taxes and its enforcement law. The criminal hierarchy calls its extraction protection and its enforcement violence. The unprotected individual faces both simultaneously. They pay taxes to the state hierarchy for protection the state often doesn't provide. They pay protection to the criminal hierarchy for safety the state won't guarantee. They have no counter-offer to either because counter-offers require enforcement capacity they don't possess. This is not exceptional. This is the default condition of individuals outside blood oath structures, in territories where multiple blood oath hierarchies operate. Why joining doesn't solve the problem? The obvious response to this analysis is, join a blood oath structure, acquire the protection it provides, stop being the exposed individual. This response is structurally coherent but individually catastrophic for reasons we have already derived. The blood oath that provides protection demands absolute loyalty as its price. The protection is real. The price is your life, your family's lives, your exit options, your capacity for internal dissent, your ability to leave when the hierarchy's direction conflicts with your values or interests. You are trading the precarity of the exposed individual for the security of the bound member. The bound member's security is genuine. Their freedom is eliminated. The hierarchy owns their enforcement capacity, their loyalty, their long-term calculation. They have solved the exposure problem by becoming property of the solution. Most people who join blood oath structures in conditions of genuine precarity are making a rational calculation under impossible conditions. The exposed individual facing extraction from multiple hierarchies without protection is genuinely worse off in the short term than the bound member with genuine protection and belonging. The blood oath's offer is real. The destruction it eventually delivers is also real. But it arrives later and precarity arrives now. This is the temporal exploitation the blood oath runs on the desperate. It front-loads the genuine goods and back-loads the existential cost. Fact, the honest map of your position. If you are an unprotected individual in a territory controlled by blood oath hierarchies, which is to say, if you are a normal person living in any modern state, your structural position can be mapped precisely. You are exploited by the state hierarchy through taxation, legal frameworks that favor capital, and selective enforcement that protects property over people. You are exploited by criminal hierarchies wherever the state's protection is absent through direct predation, market manipulation in informal economies, and the extraction of compliance through implicit or explicit violence. You are exploited by capital hierarchies, which interpenetrate both state and criminal structures, through wage extraction, rent extraction, debt extraction, and the commodification of every survival necessity. You have no enforcement capacity to counter any of these extractions. Your legal rights are real when the enforcing hierarchy finds it convenient and nominal when it doesn't. Your physical security depends on hierarchies you don't control, caring enough about your security to maintain it. This is not pessimism. It is the structural map of the individual's position in a world organized around blood oath hierarchies and their monopolies on violence. Seeing the map clearly is the prerequisite for navigating it intelligently. 9. What intelligent navigation actually looks like. The map produces specific and actionable implications for anyone whose goal is genuine sovereignty rather than the illusion of it. Build slack as the primary defense. The extracted individual is most vulnerable when survival is precarious. When any disruption to income, housing, or legal status is existentially threatening. This is when blood oath hierarchies extract maximum compliance. The person who cannot afford to say no cannot say no. Building genuine material slack, savings, reduced fixed costs, diversified income, owned rather than rented survival infrastructure, doesn't defeat the extraction logic, but it raises the floor from which you negotiate. The hierarchy can still extract. It cannot extract existential compliance from someone whose existence doesn't depend on its tolerance. Reduce legibility to extraction structures. Every system extracts from what it can see and measure. Complexity, informality, and structural opacity within legal limits. Reduce your extractability. This is not tax evasion. It is the recognition that systems optimized for extraction extract most efficiently from legible, standardized, predictable targets. The person whose economic life is entirely visible through formal employment, formal banking, and formal property ownership is maximally legible to extraction. Diversifying into less legible forms of value, skills, relationships, knowledge, informal reciprocity networks, reduces extraction surface without requiring confrontation with the extracting hierarchy. Build collective structures that distribute protection without blood oath costs. The exposed individual's fundamental vulnerability is the absence of collective enforcement capacity. Blood oath hierarchies solve this through absolute loyalty. Genuine collective alternatives, mutual aid networks, cooperative structures, communities with genuine reciprocal obligation, solve it partially through distributed commitment that doesn't require absolute loyalty. These structures are weaker than blood oath hierarchies in direct competition. They are stronger than isolated individuals in the face of extraction. They don't defeat the blood oath's structural advantage. They raise the individual's floor from isolated exposure to collective partial protection. Understand the entertainment education for what it is. The blood oath narratives in entertainment are simultaneously warning and manual. Read them structurally rather than narratively. The Sopranos is not about Tony Soprano. It is a systems-level demonstration of how blood oath logic operates, what it produces, and what it costs. Understanding the system described is more valuable than absorbing the moral the state intends you to take from the narrative. Know the logic. Know the structures operating in your territory. Know what they want from you, how they extract it, and what your position is relative to their enforcement capacity. This knowledge doesn't make you safe. It makes you less naive, which in a world organized around blood oath hierarchies is the only genuine protection available to the individual outside them. X. The honest conclusion. The Blood Oath Pact is the stable solution to the defection problem. Every serious hierarchy converges on its logic, because the selection pressure of competition eliminates structures that don't. Every alternative is structurally weaker in the dimension that determines survival under direct competition. Every individual outside Blood Oath structures is exposed to extraction by structures whose enforcement capacity they cannot match. Entertainment about Blood Oath hierarchies exists at the scale it does because the state has a direct interest in ensuring the civilian population understands these structures, respects their power, and stays outside them. The education is genuine. The interest being served by the education is the state's own monopoly maintenance. And the individual who absorbs the education structurally rather than narratively, who understands the Blood Oath's logic, the state's interest in displaying it, and their own position relative to both, is better positioned than the individual who absorbs only the moral the state intends. Not safe, not free, not exempt from extraction, but clear. And clarity in a world organized around structures specifically engineered to prevent it is the only form of sovereignty reliably available to the individual outside the Blood Oath. It is not enough, but it is real, and real is where everything else has to start.